2 groups of members present, I declare the motion as amended passed.
Members' motion with no legislative effect. Professor Lau Chi-Pang will move a motion on making Chinese history a compulsory subject at senior secondary level. Reverend Canon Pt1 will move an amendment to the motion. This council will proceed to a joint debate on the motion and the amendment. Later, I'll first call upon Professor Lau Chi-Pang to speak and move the motion. Then I will call upon Reverend Pt1 to speak, and he may not move any amendment at this stage. The joint debate now begins. Members who wish to speak, please press the request to speak button. I'll now call upon Professor Lau Chi-Pang to speak and move the motion. Thank you, President. In 2009, we introduced a new curriculum to our secondary schools, and Chinese history was now an elective subject. For over the years, only 10% of students opted for this subject. In other words, in the 12-year universal free education, 90% of them would only receive 3 years of education in Chinese history in the first junior years. This is unsatisfactory. Therefore, I hope that for secondary level, we should have make Chinese history a compulsory subject. And this will be called Chinese history, geography, and culture. This will enable students to comprehensively understand the development process of the country and also the close relationship between Hong Kong and the country, and also to carry on with the development of Chinese culture. This new subject, Chinese history, geography, and culture, will enable students to understand the country and the world. This would cultivate the right attitude and also nurture our students to be a caring citizen. In the year 2022, we heard from the policy address that there will be national education to be introduced to students so as to cultivate greater sense of national identity and pride. Supporting measures would enable the schools to continuously review their curriculum and also to incorporate elements of national education into their curriculum. In the senior secondary level, yes, it is emphasized that national history, Chinese history, will be an important element in the cultivation of a sense of national identity and togetherness. For Form 3 to Form 1 to Form 3, the curriculum on Chinese history will be enabled an understanding of the history, the personality and people, and also to cultivate a skill to learn history so as to foster a greater sense of this responsibility and identity among the students. Actually, this subject in the junior secondary can arouse interest of these students. So on this basis, if we continue to cultivate the same sense of national identity in the senior secondary level, through the introduction of this Chinese history, geography, and culture, we can consolidate the foundation that they built in junior years, and also to embark on lifelong learning. As Confucius put it, it's always a pleasure to learn continually. It brings great joy in learning activities. So for senior secondary level, this subject would bring great joy to them as a learning experience. Would there be a conflict with the existing subject of a civic education? From my personal experience, there's no conflict between the two subjects. Actually, they mutually promote one another. The first one would foster a sense of the world, modern world, and the proposed subjects, it will be a promotion of both. I know the Education Bureau has a standing mechanism to promote positive growth. It takes the collective efforts of all members of the community, and it's always important that we make the right first moves. Parents and people in the community should be engaged in exploring the curriculum contents, the training of teachers, the lecture hours to be devoted to this subject, and there should be a consultative mechanism and a testing structure to foster the students developing a sense of national identity and a sense of togetherness. With the new curriculum, we have the necessary space for this new subject. Starting from 2021 and 22, with the enhanced senior secondary curriculum introduced, 15% of classroom hours have now been left to other subjects. We can have 1 or 2 sessions per week under the new system. This will not affect the schools in deploying resources flexibly, and also is going to complement the national education curriculum. And I've been advised by people in the professional fields that this should not take the place of Chinese history as an elective history, because that subject can be a precursor to taking Chinese history as a degree program in the universities. So we have moral education and PE, and we only devote a few hours a week to these subjects, but it cultivates the interest so as to make them popular. So we can have 1 or 2 lessons in a week. It's meant to be an eye-opener, so that for those who are not taking up Chinese history as an elective subject, they will understand more about the national situation, national conditions. There are people who would comment that this would bring about a greater learning pressure. So that's why I have addressed this issue in this subject, and that is the testing would only be in two grades, pass or not pass. So the new team would come up with, I'm sure, a satisfactory mechanism to examine the students. This will tie in with the measures to promote national education in the policy address. I urge the Education Bureau to rename the Chinese history subject to Chinese history, geography, and culture. And then we can look at both the interrelationship between culture, geography, history, so that at the critical stage of their development, students can further understand the country, both past and present, and cultivate the right attitude and perception. And they will gain an in-depth knowledge and understanding of the country, and will have a greater sense of national identity. With this remark, I move my motion as printed on the agenda. I now put the question to you, and that's the motion moved by Professor Lau Chi-Pang be passed.
Reverend Canon Honorable Peter Douglas KOON. Mr. President, I would like to amend the motion. All Chinese who are seated here would not oppose to the idea of knowing about the Chinese history as to how we can make our younger people understand our Chinese history better and enhance their national awareness. I think we have a consensus. The only difference here is that as to how we are going to help our students to learn about Chinese history and what is the best way, which is the best way. We need to look at the subject matter, we should also focus on practical ways to implement it. And we need to be practical. We have to nurture the interest in Chinese history. For Chinese history to become a DSE compulsory subject in the senior secondary school education, it may sound the best route. In fact, Chinese history, culture, and geography are elements that have been sort of incorporated into our curriculum. In the year 2020, 21 junior secondary school have already introduced the compulsory subject of Chinese history. In fact, across the different subjects, you learn about Chinese history. Like for the Chinese language subject, you read classic Chinese literature articles, and you will learn about the virtues that we treasure. For the intention behind the original motion, it has my support. But to make it a compulsory subject, there will be a number of problems. First of all, we have got content spread across Chinese history, geography, citizenship, and social development, and Chinese language. If we are to set up a compulsory subject, we need to make corresponding changes to those other subjects. It may erode the effectiveness of those other subjects. And then in the light of the experience of introducing the new academic structure, we have to make changes to the structure itself, and there should be corresponding changes and redeployment of resources. Do we have sufficient Chinese history teachers to teach Chinese history dedicatedly? And we need time to prove whether the latest changes work. If we rush to make a change now, I'm afraid it will be counterproductive. And then Chinese history should be built on our experience. We should encourage them to become interested in Chinese history. I think they should find the elements of Chinese history in our daily lives. Now, we want to tell good stories of Hong Kong, tell good stories of China. So we should focus on the interaction between China and the rest of the world, so that students can sort of have empathy. We have to make sure that students are interested in learning Chinese history. We shouldn't confine students to the classrooms or confine them to a particular subject. Instead, we should have an all-round development. We should adopt a multi-pronged approach. Say, for example, students can be taken to a visit to the Hong Kong Palace Museum. We can have guided tours, and we can also develop new games, making use of VR, so that students can sort of go to the battlefields of the Three Kingdoms period, and then they learn more about Chinese history as well as our geography. Finally, if I may share a story with you. As a priest, I've always encouraged people to read the Bible and try to understand the meaning of the different biblical stories and how they can live the biblical stories in their daily lives. We need to learn about it. We should have our faith, and we should practice instead of just reciting the whole Bible. Even if you can recite the whole Bible, it doesn't mean that you know Jesus, and in fact you're belittling the Bible. This is true for Chinese history as well. If we want students to understand the significance of Chinese history, the best is that they can have a thorough understanding. So I hope members can support my amendment. So I spoke.
Secretary for Education. President, I thank Professor Lau for the motion and the Reverend Canon KOON for the amendment. I also thank them for their concern on Chinese history education in secondary schools and for their suggestions. Just like members, we endeavor to foster a sense of national identity and nationhood to give them a better understanding of the national development process. We have been improving our work, and it has borne fruit, and we have been taking forward the education of national history affairs, Chinese culture, geography, constitution, the basic law, and national security. And we also give them a better understanding of national development and the different aspects of changes of the nation. At the moment, Chinese history, geography, and culture are an indispensable part of the curriculum. For this reason, the curricula of kindergarten, primary, and secondary school, it covers a learning experience and elements of Chinese history, geography, and culture. In self and society in kindergarten, pupils get a basic understanding about Chinese culture and national identity. The Primary Education Curriculum Guide pilot version states that schools should, from a young age, strengthen the sense of nationhood, help students better understand our country in the development history, culture, and transitional values, help them build a sense of national identity, a sense of pride and ownership. The Secondary Education Curriculum Guide 2017 stipulates that reinforcing the learning of Chinese history and culture is a new key area. Currently, whether it is in junior or secondary school, there has been an enhancement of teaching of Chinese history, and to enhance the ability to learn Chinese history and to cultivate a sense of belonging and identity. And in order to ensure that there is a systematic way to teach Chinese history, in 2018-19, the Education Bureau made Chinese history an independent compulsory subject. In 2020-21 school year, starting from secondary 1, it has been extended to higher grades to ensure that all students in Hong Kong will learn Chinese history in a holistic manner. In junior secondary school, they learn about contemporary Chinese history and the history of the Chinese Communist Party. The Bureau currently focuses on curriculum implementation and support to increase teaching and learning efficiency and to enhance students' interest to select Chinese history in their senior years. Professor Lau suggested to rename Chinese history into Chinese history, geography, and culture, making it compulsory and assessing it by attained or unattained. To this, the Bureau has reservation. These are our reasons. First, the proposed changes will inevitably compress and water down senior secondary Chinese history, which is counteractive to the purpose of the motion. Currently, junior or senior secondary Chinese history emphasizes on reinforcing the understanding of important historical events and social culture aspects of different times and their interconnectedness. For senior secondary schools, it plays a pivotal role in training talents. The motion will undermine its function and deprive students the chance to choose it as an elective, which is not conducive to the study of Chinese history at a university level, especially in Chinese history. In order to attract more students to select Chinese history, we should start from the optimization of the subject and the curriculum instead of making it compulsory. And in order to achieve the goal of the motion, we cannot solely rely on Chinese history. Making it compulsory does not help to the sense of nationhood and identity. Through different subjects and learning areas, the provision of diversified activities, this is more conducive to arouse an interest of learning and its effectiveness. Say, for example, national identity and Chinese culture under general studies in primary level covers Chinese culture, geographical features, important periods, people, and events in Chinese history. Chinese language learning emphasizes on the understanding of the culture. The newly added recommended list of classical essays cultivates Chinese virtues and good character, in addition to an understanding of literature and culture. And this can link up the culture and a sense of belonging. If it is made compulsory, there is a duplication of the subject content. And currently, there are elements of geography in history. For example, the topic Yellow River in a junior secondary level highlights the long civilization of our country. And in senior secondary, it covers Chinese history in the 20th century. Say, for example, 1911 Revolution, Mayflower Movement, Communist Revolution, and modernization of socialism after New China had been founded. There are topics in secondary geography that covers the natural and human environment of the country, for example, climate movement of people, natural resources, and agricultural industrial development. Through art and sports, students learn about Chinese art, culture, and sports is learning of Chinese customs and values through different angles. And in the 2021-22 school year, under the Citizenship and Social Development in Senior Secondary School, the theme, Hong Kong under one country, two systems, and our country since reform and opening up, teach one country, two systems, development of the CCP, contributions made by the party. And field trips as well as topical studies help students understand national affairs, cityscape, and current development. It shows that learning through a holistic manner, they learn about history, geography, and culture of the country. They learn about different times. It is better than making Chinese history, geography, culture as compulsory subject. Well, if we add the fifth compulsory subject, it will have an impact on these senior secondary curriculum. We encourage students, we encourage schools to provide diversified learning activities and choices. And they need to take into account learning diversity and to broaden the knowledge base so that they can tap into their potential. This will lay a sound foundation of students. Currently, there is optimization of the 4 core subjects, that is Chinese language, English language, and 2 other subjects. This creates a space and build multiple pathways for students to take into account their capabilities. They can select an additional subject. In 21-22, it starts from secondary 4, and in 2022-23, 23-24, it will be extended to S5 and S6. Data shows that there are more students selecting an additional subject. That includes science, technology-related, and applied learning subjects, which is close to the heart of the sector. This shows that the optimization has a positive effect. We're currently collecting data through different channels to understand how schools use the lesson time released to enrich learning and development of students. Therefore, it is not suitable to introduce major changes to the overall curriculum and assessment of individual subjects so as not to dampen the effect of the optimization. In fact, through learning within and outside schools, this is better to help students learn about global affairs and to cultivate a sense of belonging and nationhood. The Bureau has been using organic integration, natural connection, diversified strategies, mutual coordination, learning out and in of the classroom to broaden experience. And these elements are embedded in different curricula and activities, and they're not confined in a subject or inside the classroom. The Bureau worked together with organizations and schools to organize different activities and competitions. That includes inter-school quizzes on the Constitution and the Basic Laws, Student Ambassador Program, History and Culture Quiz, etc. We also make use of information and technology for the development of different teaching and learning resources. Say, for example, online learning platform of famous Chinese sayings, intangible heritage, online carnival, etc. This is to extend the learning experience for students so that they can learn anywhere, anytime. We've also consolidated a national education annual activity planner. We suggest to schools that they combine historical events with learning activities in a systematic way to enhance efficiency. And there is also the Student Mainland Exchange Program and Sister School Scheme by the Bureau. Students learn about different aspects and development of the country through first-hand experience and exchanges. With the full opening of the border, the Bureau will resume mainland visits of senior secondary students from April. Exchanges of primary and secondary students will resume in an orderly manner. They will be able to see firsthand the wonderful development and achievement made by the country, and they will have a more in-depth understanding of the development of our country. Senior secondary school Chinese history has always been an elective for all students. And in relation to compulsory subjects such as Chinese language and citizenship and social development, they cover elements of Chinese history, geography, and culture. Schools may strengthen the elements taking into account their situation. And an across-the-board approach to add a compulsory subject affects the structure of the curriculum. Lesson time for core subjects will increase. Students' choices on electives, other learning experience, and time to develop other interests will be limited. This runs counter to the goal of nurturing talent diversity. Within a very short time, if we add another subject and replace replace other subjects with Chinese history, there is more harm than good. In short, Chinese history is always a core learning experience in primary and secondary schools. It's the common goal of the education sector to strengthen students' knowledge in this area. We will continue to make enhancements. Currently, in relation to schools' curriculum, teaching and learning, student subject selection pathways, teacher training, teaching materials, we have reservations in the proposed change. We will continue to take into account the needs of students to review the optimizing measures. We will also take into account the curriculum development mechanism. And through discussion led by professionals, we will make adjustments. And we will make use of the curriculum to promote the learning of the Chinese history to foster a sense of nationhood. I so submit.
Ms. Lillian Kwok. Thank you, President. I'm very grateful to Professor Lau for moving the original motion and also Reverend KOON for moving the amendment so that we have the opportunity to discuss this topic here. It's been 25 years since the handover. However, in general, people have insufficient understanding of Chinese history and also a very flimsy sense of national identity. When President Xi came to Hong Kong in July 1st last year, he said that we must lead our young people to become aware of the trends in both our country and the world and enhance their national pride and sense of being the masters. Overseas, in countries where they have a general education, attaches importance to the knowledge of their national history, and they must score pass before they can graduate. So you see, learning about one's country's history is so important, and therefore I agree and support that we must have a better understanding of Chinese history, understand Chinese geography and history and culture so that we have a comprehensive understanding of the development process of our country so as to enhance our students' sense of national pride and identity. To this end, the government has launched a number of government education policies. And in junior secondary school, Chinese history is an independent compulsory subject. However, there is still room for improvement. We should not just enhance the learning of contemporary history and Chinese geography and history and culture. We must also understand the history of the Communist Party of China so that students can understand the brilliant achievements by our country since reform and opening up, so our students can share the country's perspective and expedite the development process of the country. Now, people who choose Chinese history as a compulsory subject as an elective subject is on the low side, and that is less than 10% of the student cohort. So people are not very interested in Chinese history. So we must raise their interest so as to enhance our students' understanding and interest in Chinese history. The EDB has got this policy of exchange programs for our students to the mainland, and different learning and teaching activities should be designed to make learning interesting. The use of technology together with a traditional mode of learning can encourage and motivate our students. But the EDB earlier on trim down the curriculum of our senior secondary Chinese history from 65% of the lesson times has been now reduced to 50% to allow more room for our students. However, teachers have a heavy workload and they do not have sufficient time, and as a result, they can do not a lot. Although education reform is important, I think we should enhance students' comprehensive understanding of the country's history, geography, and culture so that we can nurture talents for our country that are patriotic and who love Hong Kong as well. President Xi, in his address, said that we must cherish our talents, and our young talents should have integrity as well as knowledge, and patriotism is an indispensable part of it. So we must enhance our students' knowledge in Chinese history, geography, and culture so that they can inherit the wisdom and culture of the country, so that the whole country can move and work hard towards the goal of realization of the revitalization of the grand Chinese nation. Mr. Chen Kim-po, I thank Professor Lau for his motion to make Chinese history a compulsory subject at senior secondary level and to add Chinese history, geography, and culture into the curriculum. Proper and thorough understanding of our country is an important part in developing patriotism. So I fully agree with Professor Lau. However, how can we achieve this goal? There are a number of practical issues to consider. Now, there are 4 core subjects in senior secondary curriculum, and instead of liberal studies, students have citizenship and social development now. And now they have to learn about reform and our country since reform and opening up, interconnectedness and independence of the contemporary world, one country, two systems of Hong Kong, etc. So there are views that to enhance students' and national affection. Now, we've already got such elements in CS subject, and if you think that the subject or the curriculum is not meaty enough, we can beef it up, and I think that can be a way out. People from the education sector have said the students face a lot of stress under DSE, and so instead of LS, they have CS, and the number of teaching hours have been reduced greatly from 250 hours to 150, so as to alleviate the burden of our students. That is a popular and welcome move. And then if the lesson time is used for another core subject, that would add to the pressure of our students. And I think students have to prepare students for the DSE examination, and that is heavy enough. I think the concern of the education sector is understandable. To nurture or cultivate national affection and national pride in our students, we should not resort to rote learning anymore. We should use more dynamic, flexible, and interesting mode of teaching so the students can be motivated to learn. CS is the first step. So the grading system is just attained or unattained, and through mainland visits, students can acquire new knowledge about the country. Chinese history and humanities are rather traditional, and students are required to recite their lesson content. And if we can use more dynamic, flexible arrangement, then if we reduce the amount of rote learning, and that can alleviate the academic burden on students. When students enjoy learning, then they can acquire the necessary knowledge, and then they can develop a sense of affection for the country. Thank you.
Mr. Duncan Chiu, thank you, President. As a Chinese national, in terms of Chinese history, I think it is necessary to dedicate a certain amount of lesson time to learn it. Now, what are we going to school for? Well, besides education of knowledge, I think it is most important to develop an interest in learning among students. The world is changing very quickly. If you leave school after 3 years, everything will change. If you are not learning, after 10 years, you would be eliminated in terms of competition. Just look at AI. What we have today is very different from what we had before. If we don't develop a lifelong learning attitude among young people, they will lose their competitiveness. Now, I am a history buff. Like my schoolmates, I was very familiar with the Three Kingdoms stories, and I read a lot of history books. Rather than in school, I think it was my family members, especially my father, who influenced my interest rather than how the teachers taught it at school. I didn't get an A in Chinese history subject despite my history knowledge. I was educated in a famous elite school. However, we were just asked to remember all the history books to prepare for examination. I really wondered why we were learning Chinese history like that. Are we really studying for exam only? Now, the 5 dynasties and the 10 kingdoms have very rich histories. They are very interesting stories with a lot of famous characters, historic figures. Now, the school didn't teach us the interesting stories of the period. Well, we were just asked how long the Great War was and what is the time period for the Tang dynasty and how many times did the Western Han dynasty move its capital. Now, decades after my 2 children are studying in secondary school, I got a glimpse of the Chinese history examination papers, and I'm very disappointed. It is just the same as my era. Now, there is a question about how the emperor waged a war and where did the Han emperor found his capital. This is all rote learning. Rather than nurturing an interest in Chinese history, we are just testing the students' memories. In this age and era, we have all we need on the internet. You just have to do a search on the internet and you can find the answer immediately. There's no point in memorizing the answers anymore. Now, today, I still have a hard time convincing my children to learn Chinese history. They don't like rote learning. So I definitely support enhancing learning in Chinese history and Chinese. However, in this day and era, if we don't drastically reform how we teach Chinese history and also the examination system, even if we make it a compulsory subject, it doesn't mean that we can improve students' interest in learning Chinese history. So I hope the Education Bureau would reform on how we teach Chinese history. Despite all the secretary said just now, my children are still taught the same way as I was. So I hope there will be better reform to make Chinese history more interesting and nurture in them a sense of belonging so that they are interested in learning our country's past. Thank you. Dr. Zhao Mankong, President, stepping up education of Chinese history as well as enhancing students' sense of belonging as well as a sense of responsibility is very important. I agree with the original intent in the motion. I understand that if we make Chinese history a compulsory subject at senior secondary level, there will be a lot of problems. However, if we take comprehensive consideration, it is not that hard. In year 2011 and 2012, the Education Bureau implemented the enhancement measures and released some 250 lesson hours so that students can get some more in-depth understanding of the subjects, and also allow students to understand the country more deeply with the citizenship and social development subject. So I don't think it is the fact that we don't have room to include more elements like Chinese history, geography, and culture in these subjects. In 2018, the Education Bureau has made Chinese history an independent compulsory junior secondary curriculum subject, and also the syllabus has been revamped so that there can be a better understanding of the country's development, especially including Hong Kong's role in different era. For example, in Tang Dynasty, students would be taught about the women in that day and age. Students are able to understand the culture and history from multiple perspectives. So we don't have to worry that it is not interesting enough. I understand that Professor Lau Jipang, as the chair of the panel of Chinese history, he has done a lot in terms of diversifying the syllabus. At the junior secondary level, students are already well prepared with a good foundation, so there is no point to stop at the senior level. Of course, we need time to prepare for making it a compulsory subject, but we do have the conditions to make it a compulsory subject for senior students. Earlier on, the advanced level examination has the Chinese culture subject, and there are 6 chapters and 1 additional reading. For example, Mr. Tang Junyi's book on youth and Chinese culture. It really inspired students and nurtured in them the traditional ethics. Now, the Education Bureau is attaching a lot of importance to use Chinese subjects to enhance students' cultural and moral standing, and nurture in students a positive value and strengthen their sense of responsibility to Hong Kong and the country. So I think the Education Bureau should rename Chinese as Chinese and Chinese culture and increase the number of lesson time. Now, there is one saying in an old drama: Hong Kong and the mainland are connected. I'm so proud to see what the country has achieved. So it really made me think, how can we allow students to develop such a sentiment? We should let students know what people's life is in the country and how beautiful the country's scenery is. There can be 5 to 7 days visits to Taishan and Wuyishan and other intangible cultural heritage to learn deeply our country's culture, rather than a short trip to Guangzhou that would achieve nothing. And also there is room to include more elements in terms of our country's history. And also, so I think we should include a lot of geographical elements in these visits. Now, citizenship and social development, as well as national security education, are very important. We cannot afford to have a gap between junior and secondary students. Now, there are schools which focus too much on ranking. Some schools even use English to teach Chinese history. According to some professors, concerning a certain period, a certain historical period in the Chinese history, they would have to use English as a medium of teaching. I think this is really wrong. I think the Education Bureau must step in to set the priority right. Thank you. Mr. Sunny Tang. President, in the past, we can find the future. President Xi often says history is the best textbook, and also it can give us clarity. I agree that Chinese history can help us nurture a sense of belonging among students. Over the past, we had insufficient teaching in terms of Chinese history. We have to rectify the situation. We have to make sure that students understand the country's culture, history, and development, and also its constitution, as well as the background and history behind the country's establishments. Like President Xi said, without the Chinese Communist Party, there will not be a new China. Without a new China, there will not be a great rejuvenation for the Chinese people. After the Opium War, the Chinese people experienced a lot of hardship. As the darkest time, the CCP led its people to independence and also created the conditions for the future reform and opening. It led the country to prosperity and led people out from famine to prosperity. It is very important for us to understand the past, present, and future of the country. When there is one country, we can really see the benefits of two systems. And what we have now is hard to come by. I agree with the amendments moved by Reverend KOON that we have to make sure that Chinese history is made essential learning experience in the secondary education. There should be connection from primary to junior secondary curriculum so that the students understand Chinese history, geography, and culture. Well, I have reservation whether we should make Chinese history a compulsory subject. DSE results is closely related to students' future. There are already 4 core subjects: Chinese, English, mathematics, and the CS, citizenship and social development. With another core subject, it will increase lesson time and add to students' stress. And also, if we raise the subject with attained or not attained, some elite students will lose their opportunities to get 5-star stars. Chinese history is already a compulsory junior secondary curriculum subject. It covers historical figures, culture, and also society. If we enrich the Chinese history syllabus at the junior secondary level, we don't have to make the subject compulsory for senior subjects. In the mainland, it is not a compulsory subject at the senior level, as well as same for Singapore. Books are not the only way to learn. We can go out of the classroom and take students on study visits to nurture in them an interest in Chinese history. Like citizenship and social development, I think schools can take students to the mainland to understand the country's development, and they can also visit the Palace Museum as well as the Xiju Center in the West Kowloon Cultural District. Through national security education, we can also enhance students' sense of belonging and their understanding in the country's culture. And I hope that a society can work together to nurture a sense of national identity for our next generation so that they are proud of being a Chinese in Hong Kong. Mr. Dennis Leung. Thank you, President. This motion has no legislative effect. However, this is a very hotly debated topic. If it is passed, it may mean that students must pass the Chinese history subject to become a university student. Parents may be worried, and the schools and teachers will have to do a lot of preparation, and a lot of resources will have to be allocated by the Education Bureau. Now, these are my views as a former teacher. Many students are worried that they would fail the 4 core subjects. So sometimes they would study overseas, and then come back to study in Hong Kong. If Chinese history is made a compulsory subject, it may exacerbate the attrition of students as well as teachers. This is our worry. And also, it may be counterproductive in terms of nurturing an interest for Chinese history. Now, if we ask secondary senior students to learn Chinese history so that they have a greater sense of belonging and sense of pride, I think this is too naive, and it is not scientific. Well, I have been urging the Education Bureau to put more focus on science education in primary level. Well, then should I propose to the Education Bureau that the science subject and also the computer subjects be made compulsory? Well, I wouldn't do that. In the last academic year, the liberal studies has been transformed into the citizenship and social development subjects. This is only the second year. The syllabus is yet to be enriched, and the syllabus is very rich. One country, two systems, as well as other study visits, and also reform and opening up of the country. Well, to enrich the syllabus, it takes time. Curriculum development is a professional area requiring expertise. Not every student has the ability to study Chinese history. It is an elective subject, so that there is flexibility for students to choose according to their interest and ability. If we make it a compulsory subject, we may be turning a blind eye to the existing issue within the subject. It requires a lot of memorizing and rote learning. That's why a lot of students are put off. Now, if we agree with the motion to make the Chinese history subjects compulsory, the question is, do we have sufficient teacher teaching these subjects? Well, in the past, a lot of teachers have to undergo training to teach the liberal studies subjects. Now, our education system rank among top in the world because we have dedicated teachers for each subject. If we don't have sufficient teacher to teach the Chinese history, geography, and culture subjects, it would undermine the efficiency. Now, I'm worried that Chinese history would become another liberal studies subject. By renaming Chinese history to Chinese history, geography, and culture, we are including geography and culture elements into the subject. The syllabus will be much wider. Can we accommodate the syllabus with a limited lesson time? The syllabus is simply too massive. Not every student can handle it. Well, when we implemented the CS subjects, the other three core subjects have to release more lesson hour to make way for CS. Now, if we add another core subject, it would disrupt the arrangements of the lesson hour. It would hinder development of the students. I don't disagree with minor adjustments. However, if we are making this Chinese history subject a compulsory subject, we need wide consultation as well as expert studies to achieve our goals. Thank you.
Mr. Kenneth Lau. President, I speak to support the original motion to make Chinese history a compulsory subject in senior secondary level. This will get students to have a more in-depth understanding of the development process of the country. And this will teach them about the rejuvenation of the nation, contributions made by the party to the nation's development. This will also cultivate a sense of nationhood, identity, and belonging. Chinese culture can be passed on. This is in line of President Xi's words on the 1st of July. That is, one country, two systems, and patriotism should be further promoted. If you want to know about the future, you need to learn about what happened in the past. You learn lessons from what happened before. You use the wisdom accumulated to get a better understanding of the world. I think that Hong Kong cannot afford another traumatic period of black-clad violence. Over 2,000 youngsters, due to an inadequate understanding of the country, were unduly influenced by Western forces. They ended up having been arrested by the police. We cannot lose any more youngsters. We cannot see the same incident repeating. We need to make Chinese history a compulsory subject so that youngsters will get a correct understanding of our history, the positioning of our nation, and the principle of one country, so that we can tap into the potential of two systems. Our country has a long history. Very often, because of limited lesson time, ancient history has been neglected. Modern contemporary history is fragmented. Students don't get a comprehensive view. And I agree with Professor Lau's suggestion that students will learn about the past and present of the country, and they learn about the interconnectedness and relations of the different times. The horizons will be broadened, and it will not simply be learned by rote. I'm sure that senior secondary students have discerning eyes, and they will be able to learn from Chinese history. In terms of the design of the curriculum, I suggest that there should be an emphasis of the relationship of Hong Kong with different times. Say, since the Qing dynasty is already part of China, and there is the Wall of Resistance, indigenous villages of the new territories fought valiantly. This will help them better understand that Hong Kong share the same fate with our country. We have a rich history of the Wall of Resistance. We have a museum in Sha-Tao-Kok. We have Wu Kao Tang and Sai Kung Cenotaph. They are very good teaching materials. They should be made use of and further promoted to forge a sense of belonging. Visits to the mainland should be resumed as soon as possible. We encourage students to participate. We need to strengthen exchanges with mainland schools. They should not just be superficial visits. Youngsters will pass the baton of our history. They need to be taught the correct understanding of our history so that they can tell good stories of Hong Kong and of our country to the rest of the world. Mr. Kenneth Leung. I thank Professor Lau for moving the original motion so that we have a platform to talk about how we can integrate Chinese history into our curriculum. There is a famous scholar who said that we need to learn from history, and we need to learn about our country and to forge a sense of patriotism. In short, what he says is that knowing about our history will forge a sense of patriotism. Countries attach a lot of importance to their own history. They make use of education to teach the nation about a correct understanding of the nation, and this in turn will forge a sense of nationhood, identity, and belonging. Because of legacy issues, Hong Kong people don't have a correct understanding of the history of our country. We might have, it might have been some time since the reunification because of various reasons. Recent times, there is the epidemic. Students don't get a good chance to learn about Chinese history. You need to learn about history, not just by reading, but by visits. They can visit the Forbidden City, the Xi'an Terracotta Army. With the opening up of the border, visits can resume. But school visits is not like a pleasure trip. A lot of planning goes into it. There should be a good itinerary for the journey to be fruitful. There was a gap of 3 years. A lot of the teachers in charge of these visits have left their posts, and now the visits are taken up by inexperienced teaching staff. Good organizers have already left the trade, so you don't know who to approach. Nowadays, students learn using the internet. If you want them to leave their house to learn, you will have to make a bigger effort. For mainland visits, whether it's a day trip or a month trip to the Silk Road, they all serve the same purpose as long as they are rich in content. I asked the government to train planners and to enhance promotion and publicity so that these visits will effectively help students learn about our history. Well, we have the youth blueprint. We need to nurture our youngsters to be the new generation with international horizon. We do need to do more work in this regard. But does it mean that we have to change the assessment mechanism and the content of the curriculum? I have reservations. We need to have a detailed discussion with the sector. We have to have confidence in our history. That is a major force for us to progress. Through accurate learning of our history and visits, I'm sure that youngsters will have the correct understanding and they will be our new generation to make contributions to our country. I so submit. Mr. Andrew Lam. Thank you. I thank Professor Lau for moving the original motion and the Reverend Canon KOON for the amendment. We have martial art novels by Louis Cha. In the past 10 years, we learn about I learned about Chinese history and the relationship with the rest of the world. That's become my hobby. When we talk about Chinese history, we talk about change of dynasties and systems. It's very rare that we hear about the interrelationship of the different elements, say history, geography, and culture, as mentioned in Professor Lau's motion. I know that the 4 great inventions of China is not congee and rice. However, if they can make use of congee or tomatoes or pepper and relate it to our history, then it will pique my my interest. They can also make use of the Western technology introduced in ancient times and how it affected the technology of China. That will be another interesting subject. It is necessary to give more room for us to understand our history. We have a long history. We have a vast area. We have multiple ethnic races involved. We can't learn this by rote. we need to have interactive, interesting contents that will make you think, so that we can transform the hard and dead knowledge into something that we can use. But as to whether we should make this a compulsory subject in senior secondary, it involves implementation issues. We need to take into account the needs of students and whether they can cope. If we do it without catering for students' needs, it may backfire. There is very little information on contemporary history. We do need to plug that gap. When it comes to the interpretation and choice of teaching material of contemporary history, I think that there will be more controversy. We need to have more discussion, studies, so that we can correctly choose the right material to teach. We should not rush to make a decision. The current citizenship and social development has given us a platform, and Chinese language will also give us a chance to learn about history and geography of the country. We need to have a systematic study on design, content of the syllabus. We can, in a more effective way, turn it into a curriculum that will help students understand better the different aspects of our country. And we can also cultivate a sense of nationhood and identity. We need to have passion. We can make use of museums, historical buildings, music, films, and cultural activities to achieve these goals, and they'll be more effective. I so submit.
Mr. Lee Chan-keung. Thank you, President. We have passed 25 years since the handover, and during the past 25 years, we have got the Occupy Central movement, the Black Hat violence in 2019, and the movement against national education, etc. And then there were external forces colluding with local people, and we have seen major issues with our young people's sense of the country. To cultivate our young people's sense of belonging and national identity and national pride, these are important values. Many people think that it is important that we enhance education in Chinese history. Chinese history is only a compulsory independent subject in senior or in junior secondary education. However, learning is a continuum. Learning history can help our young people to build up the perspective about the world. Teaching and learning should cover not just ancient history, but contemporary histories as well. In particular, we should understand the development history and process of the Communist Party of China and its various contributions to the development of modern China. After all, the CPC is the ruling party of the PRC and has contributed a lot to the development of the country. From a poor and a closed country, the CPC has led the country to become a prosperous and modern one. But if you go and ask our young people the names of our state leaders, they can only give you the names of famous figures like Mao Zedong, Deng Xiaoping, and our presidency. They may not be able to tell you who are the vice presidents and also the deputies to the MPC, etc. Not to mention the contribution of the CPC and also the important spirits and addresses in the past National Congress. They will not be able to tell you that. So we must enhance our people's understanding of the history of CPC. If you ask people or students who are studying Chinese history their impression about the subject, they will feel that it is just a learning by heart and it's boring and dull, and they think negatively about learning Chinese history. Many serving teachers are of the view that should there be any change to the curriculum of the Chinese history subject, there must be less learning by rote, and the lesson must be more interesting so as to help young people to develop a sense of national identity. The Chinese nation have 5,000 years of history. Learning Chinese history is not about reciting facts. I think we can learn from the experience of our ancestors so that we can do better now. We can learn about their culture in eating, in dressing, clothing, and how they develop themselves and the families and the country. I think they are all important elements of Chinese culture. But should Chinese history be a compulsory subject? I think at this moment I have some reservation, because if Chinese history is to be the 5th core subject, inevitably this will add to the burden of our students, science students in particular. They're worried that if they cannot do the subject well, their chance of getting into university will be affected, and therefore the Liberal Party supports Reverend Canon KOON's amendment. We must teach Chinese history in a lively, interesting manner to raise their motivation to learn. And to enhance patriotism among our students, we can have campaign vehicles go into school campuses. There can be essay competitions and quizzes of Chinese history, and we can arrange for in-depth exchange programs in the mainland so that our students can have a better understanding of one country, two system, and they become future masters of society. The country is a big one, and we must review the curriculum of Chinese history so that everyone can learn about different aspects of the country. They can build up a sense of national identity and patriotism, and they can tell good stories of Hong Kong, and we can together fight for the revitalization of the rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. Mr. Rukshan, it's been 25 years since the handover. However, our young people do not have a strong sense of national identity. And in 2019, many students were influenced by external forces, and that led to the Black Clef violence. Fortunately, we are now in the transition from stability to prosperity, and it is necessary that we instill a sense of belonging to the country among our young people. Now, in the senior secondary curriculum, Chinese history is only an elective subject. On average, only 6,000 students elected Chinese history in senior secondary education. To enhance a deeper understanding of the country's history, geography, and culture, I really welcome the idea that we make Chinese history a compulsory learning experience throughout secondary education. They should learn about the development history of the country so that we can cultivate in students a sense of belonging to our students. Now, Chinese history should be a compulsory learning experience instead of the 5th core subject, because that will increase the proportion of teaching hours occupied by core subjects. This goes against the intention of our earlier reform of the education system. So making it a learning experience will not affect the number of core subjects required of our students, and it will not affect the learning of our students. To achieve our objectives, we must take care of the following 4 points. First, we must have professional Chinese history teachers teaching the subject. They should make Chinese history into interesting stories to enhance the motivation of our students. Instead of rote learning, the learning should be flexible, and students should be taught analytical and also other skills. And thirdly, there should be visits included in the curriculum. Students should be taken to museums and join guided tours so they have personal experience. And fourthly, we should use technology. We can use VR and game-based to lead our students to visit or to meet different important historical figures and participate in important historical events, so that by means of technology we can make it an interactive and participating process. Lastly, I suggest that the government should include Chinese history elements into the CS subject. The CS subject has got one country, two systems, and our country since reform and opening, and also interconnectedness and interdependence of the country and of the contemporary world. I suggest that in the CS subject we have more weighting. We put more weight on Chinese history. This will not affect the Hong Kong DSE, and the total number of teaching hours will still be 50%, and we will not change our assessment and appraisal system. This is worthy of consideration. Thank you. Mr. Tek Chi-yun. Thank you. As Chinese, being Chinese, I think we should have a deep understanding of the country's history and culture, as well as policies and the country's development, and also the strengths and weaknesses of the country, so that we can develop a sense of national identity. By means of national education, we can help our young people to understand the history, geography, and culture of the country. This is a very reasonable proposal. I'm sure all countries have national education for their students, because building up a sense of identity will help strengthen the country. Well, there was a proposal to implement national education. That was a controversy, but I think it is important that we introduce national education to our young people. So back then I supported the proposal. There were worries back then. We stressed there was not a brainwashing mode of education. Students should allowed to be critical and analytical. Our country has done well in many aspects in terms of poverty alleviation. We can learn how the country has achieved that. But of course, we can also explore possible inadequacies of the country's work in poverty alleviation. So our understanding of the country should be very dynamic and three-dimensional. And we should allow young people to criticize the country as well, not in a damaging way, rather in a positive manner. We can learn lessons from mistakes made by the country, and we should have three levels of national understanding and education. First, basic understanding. We should understand the history, geography, and culture of the country. Second, there must be participation. Together, we can engage in learning experiences in the community and in the country. And lastly, we should develop a sense of identity and belonging to our country. Admittedly, there has been a very charged discussion of national education in the community. There are various ways to implement national education in schools, and some want schools to arrange more exchange programs or visits to the mainland that can assist our young people to learn about the country more and to develop a sense of a national identity. But then education is education. We are not hard selling the country to our students. So the means counts. Quantity doesn't mean that we're going to be successful. We should allow schools room to do it their own way based on the characteristics of the students in implementing national education. We should not impose on schools on how to implement national education because that can backfire. So I don't think we should put in too many restrictions and dictate how schools implement national education. So I support Reverend KOON's amendment because it is more flexible. Thank you.
Mr. Pt1, thank you, Madam Deputy. This is about making Chinese history a compulsory subject at senior secondary level. Dr. Dick said just now about his views on national education. Well, I think concerning national education, I think everyone here would support Professor Lau Ji-Pang's original motion, but that's not the point. The focus here is Chinese history. I was an A-level student. Back then, I really struggled through the 6-hour-long examination. I read a lot of history books, like Duncan Chiu said. Well, there are people, however, who were not history buff, but they got an A because they could write faster and prettier than me. And they could memorize more stuff than I did. This shows that how an interesting subject is being distorted under a rote learning focused examination system. The perception is that to do well in the Chinese history subjects, you have to write a lot of stuff. Well, I think if we make Chinese history a compulsory subject with a leap, well, many members who are more practical would think it is undoable. However, I understand where the professor was coming from. The importance of Chinese history is not as important as national understanding to us Hong Kong people. If we know the distant ancient history of our country, it is not as important as we understand the 20th National Congress report. Well, I beg a school to let me do a talk there concerning the 20th National Party Congress report. I told the students we are an international city. Well, an expatriate boss may ask the graduates, "Oh, what is all the talk about the 20th National Party Congress reports all about?" The graduates might not be able to answer them, so they would rather hire mainland Chinese students or mainland students returning from the overseas because this is their strength. Well, they would still hire Chinese, but not Hong Kong people, but people who came to Hong Kong under the Top Talent Pass scheme. So I think to understand the national development is much more important than Chinese history. I think we have to have a comprehensive understanding of Chinese history. Mr. Lam Yifu, my favorite economist, said that in the 18th century, Britain was the founding seed of economics because it was the economic engine. And in the 19th century, it was the US because the economic engine in the world was Chicago. Now in the 20th century, our country is the main engine of economic development. Are we ready? Are we still using Adam Smith theory Is there a new school of thought other than the Chicago school of thought? How can we interpret the economic miracle that we have seen in our country? So I think we really have to take a comprehensive look at the country. Say, for example, I highly recommend Mr. Yang Zhenling's a Nobel Literature Laureate. His writing, it is a very friendly read, but it also talks about the country's development. Well, I think there are a lot of ways to enhance Hong Kong people's patriotism. Still, I thank Professor Lau Chi-Pang for your efforts. I have read a lot of your work. I admire you. But rather than making Chinese history compulsory subjects at senior or secondary level, why don't we make these subjects a compulsory subject at the university level? They would be more capable in absorbing these knowledge. They are the pillar of the society, and they have to have a sense of national belonging. Thank you. Mr. Tommy Zhang. Thank you, Madam Deputy. Now, the Education Bureau has announced a lot of curriculum guides. For example, Primary Education Curriculum Guide 2022, and also Secondary Curriculum Guides 2017. There are lots of talks about enhancing students' understanding of the country's history and culture. This is necessary. Since opening up and reform, the country has developed a lot. We have to prepare the students to seize the opportunities brought about by national development. Schools and the Education Bureau have the responsibility to enhance their students' understanding of Chinese history, geography, and culture and economy. They should be allowed to explore different facets of the country's development and also explore the interconnectivity between history, geography, and the people. This is the right thing to do, and we can afford no delay. However, the design would be very complicated if we make it a compulsory subject. There are a lot of views that it is not the right time, and also it would be a hindrance for students who would like to study further in the university. Now, the Chinese history is an independent subject for junior secondary students, including different areas, including religions, economy, and also contemporary China. This can prepare students for further study at the university level and to prepare them to become Chinese history teacher. However, if we make Chinese history a compulsory subject for senior secondary students, we have to trim down the syllabus, and it would deprive students of the chance to learn more Chinese history, and it would be counterproductive because they would be less knowledgeable. I think we have to address all the wrinkles, including university enrollment requirements, and also whether there is enough lesson time to teach Chinese history, and whether we have to update our textbooks. The government must step up communication with society to address these issues. And also, we have just made the subject a compulsory subject at the junior level. We need time to see the efficacy of the measure. I think this is not the right time to make a hasty decision. Madam Deputy, I so submit. Mr. Ambrose Lam. I thank Professor Lam for moving this motion. I support his idea to make Chinese history a compulsory subject at senior secondary level. I oppose to the amendment. When I was in secondary school, Chinese history wasn't a compulsory subject. I support the idea today because of a very simple reason. I want to quote you, Mr. Gong Ji-zhen's saying. He's a scholar in Qing dynasty. If you want to destroy a country, you have to destroy its history. If you want to destroy a race, you have to destroy its culture. Well, during the 100 years where Hong Kong was under colonial rule, that was what the British colonial governments did. We have the Black Lives riots and also chaos. There are Hong Kong people calling them Chinese in a derogatory way. We are at the age of development. We have to catch up. Now, let me quote another saying from another scholar to support the point why we have to make history a compulsory subject. It will be beneficial to our development. Mr. Qian Mu, in his major masterpiece, he said this in the preamble. For those who claim to be educated, they should know a thing or two about the history of their country. And also, these people should have an affection for the past of their country. And also respect. Well, with love and respect for the past of the country, they will not embrace nihilism concerning the past of the country. And also it will put them at a higher viewpoint. And they will not blame their plight on their ancestors. If there are more people like that in that country, then there will be hope for that country to develop furthermore. Now, Hong Kong, under the one country, two systems principle, we must know a thing or two about the country's past. If young people thrive, the country will thrive. It is a shame that the new generation doesn't know much about the history of Hong Kong and the country. And also, foreign powers have distorted our country's past and created an atmosphere of extreme nihilism. We are blaming the past and blaming our ancestors, and we are denying our culture. That's why there are people who still cling on to the colonial era. As Mr. Chen Wu said, those who claim to be educated should know more about the country's past. So I think we must make Chinese history a compulsory subject. But we have to pay attention to the historical perspective. Because of political tension, contemporary history has been distorted by foreign powers. For example, the theory that the country is crumbling or that the country is a threat to the world. It creates a sense of extremism. In teaching the subject, we have to educate the young people to have an affection and respect for the history of the country. I hope our education sector can learn from Mr. Chen Wu and help our students to better understand our country. I hope members will support Professor Lau's original motion and make Chinese history a compulsory subject at senior secondary level. I so submit. Thank you.
Mr. Tang Fei. Madam Deputy, as to whether we should make Chinese history and geography a compulsory subject, whether there is a seamless learning of these subjects, this is my view. We do need to learn about history and geography of our country, but do we have to make them compulsory subjects? I think there is leeway. Students of different levels have different learning needs. For primary and secondary school education, this is not just about basic learning. It's also the time to forge the right values. So if we are to teach the correct understanding of our history, then of course we need to make good use of history and geography throughout the years. For younger years, there will be a basic teaching of information. Well, currently, Chinese geography is not compulsory. If we want to add that, it's easier. We only have to enhance the current geography subject in junior secondary level by adding information of Chinese geography. But in order to relieve pressure of students back in 1996. A few subjects have been combined into general studies. So we have Chinese, English, mathematics, and general studies. So general studies covers humanities as well as science subjects. But we think that history, geography, culture being mixed into one single subject may reduce learning pressure. But if you name it general study, is the wrong name. So it is incorrectly named. If you name it general studies, then students will not give it the respect and importance due. People think that it is an unnecessary subject. Well, I think that Chinese history can become an independent subject, and geography can see the addition of a Chinese geography. And general study will include other subjects. If the Bureau can increase teacher supplies, and that, I think that would be better. Currently, we have Chinese, English, and CS, that is Citizenship and Social Development. I think in Chinese, we use the wrong abbreviation to give a misunderstanding. It was previously liberal studies. Of course, if there is an additional subject, there will be additional pressure. Previously, well, CS replaces liberal studies, and the lesson time for Chinese and English has been reduced so that more time is allocated to other subjects. If there is an additional compulsory subject, this runs counter to the original intention. I think Chinese history and geography can be subsumed under CS. And currently there are such elements in CS. That means you learn about Chinese history and geography without making it a compulsory subject and add to the pressure of students. I so submit. Mr. Chen Xiu-hung, I speak to thank Professor Lau for moving the motion so we have a chance to talk about how secondary students can better learn about Chinese history. And I also support Reverend KOON's amendment. Learning about Chinese history is a chance for us to learn about what happened to our ancestors. We learn the mistakes made in the past so that we can avoid the same. So I ask students to learn more about Chinese history and the history of our country. But in the original motion, there is a proposal to rename Chinese history to history, geography, and culture. I have reservations. First of all, we don't have sufficient qualified teacher of Chinese history. From what I've learned, for senior secondary, Chinese history is an elective. There are only 1 or 2 teachers. For 80% of schools, there is only 1 teacher for senior level. Each class has about 15 to 30 students. If you make Chinese history a compulsory subject, that means all senior secondary students will have to take the lesson. There is insufficient teachers. If teachers of other subjects will have to take up this subject as well, that means they have to teach on top of their own subject. And they are not subject teachers. The teaching may not be as effective. Some people think that making it compulsory will add to the pressure of students. We now have Chinese, English, maths and CS. If you add another compulsory subject, it will add to the pressure. And lesson time will increase. That means students will have to spend more time on lesson. And there will be less time for electives. And there was a proposal to increase STEM learning. And all these add to the pressure of students. Currently, in CS, there is one country, Hong Kong under one country, two systems, and our country since reform and opening up. There are historical elements in this. Of course, this can't compare to a separate subject. That's why I agree with Reverend KOON's amendment that Chinese history should be made an essential learning experience. I think history should cover what happened in different period. Our country was bullied at one time. Now we have risen up. We have made great achievements in different aspects, say, for example, Belt and Road initiatives. And we are the third country that have manned spacecraft sent to space. And we also have lifted the entire population out of poverty. So we have made a lot of great achievements. We need to teach history and culture to forge a sense of identity, but you don't have to do it through a subject. To arouse interest apart from learning from an interesting teacher, schools should make use of information and technology, AR, VR, to reenact important historical events, achievements, important wars, so that students can learn about these things in a more interesting way. And we need to make use of the Hong Kong Palace Museum and the Museum of History. There can be themed visits. We make use of guided tours and exhibits to enhance learning. In whatever country and for whatever race, learning about the country's history is something that's basic. We have the duty to teach students about various aspects of the country and to cultivate a sense of nationhood. We are Chinese. We need to make use of different approaches to deepen understanding of our history and culture so that we can enhance a sense of identity. I so speak. Dr. Kennedy Wong. I thank Professor Lau for moving the original motion. I think that secondary students do need to learn about Chinese history to forge a sense of nationhood, identity, and belonging. They need to have a more comprehensive understanding of national development. As to the means, I keep an open mind. When it comes to Chinese history, whether it is a rejuvenation of our nation and for individual development, there are significance. In terms of rejuvenation of our nation, it has to be a compulsory subject for students to learn about the development over 5,000 years of history. Students will, from their heart, grow a sense of identity and belonging and a sense of pride. On the level of personal development, just like a world-renowned scholar said, when it comes to Chinese history, it makes you wise. Making it compulsory will help students to learn about Chinese history. They learn from history. They are trained to think and analyze from different perspectives, and they will be encouraged to pursue better lives. In many countries, the history of their country is an important part of secondary education. This is also an important element in the passing on of customs. In the U.S., U.S. history is a core subject. In Canada, students will have to learn about the history as well, and that is the same for other European countries. If it is neglected, there will be a bumpy ride for development. In Hong Kong, we've seen advocates of Hong Kong independence and black-clad violence. It shows the importance of correct understanding of our history. Of course, when it comes to reform and design of the curriculum, it involves a professional discussion and it takes time. So I support the Reverend KOON's amendment that at this stage, we will enhance knowledge of Chinese history, including geography and culture of secondary school, and it should be made an essential learning experience. The enhancement of teaching of history, geography, and culture of our country is essential. I expect the education sector, parents, schools, teachers, students, the Education Bureau will attach importance to this, and they should work together for the rejuvenation of our nation and for the implementation of one country, two systems, so that we can nurture a new generation.
主席，
Mr. Champula, Madam Deputy, history education is an integral part of whole person education. Chinese history will help us to build up a proper perspective of history and a proper sense of national identity. And we should start from teachers. Junior secondary Chinese history focuses on a relationship between historical figures and events. And for senior secondary Chinese history, we should allow our students to develop a proper perspective of history and understand the development trends and characteristics of different periods. And I think we should explore the development of Chinese history so that from the perspectives of history, culture, geography, and religion, students can have a better understanding of the country. And then there can also be learning experiences. We can enhance our students' understanding of the country, and they can also cultivate a positive attitude and value for life. These are very important characters, and it can prepare our students for senior or higher education. And so we must have proper history education to build up a sense of history, and they can then cultivate a sense of national identity. Now, the number of students taking Chinese history in DSE is reducing. In 2013, the figure was 8,000. In 2020, it dropped to 6,000. And last year, it only 10% of the candidates set for the Chinese history examination. So interest is low for Chinese history. Why? Because of the teaching model or the methodology? Or is it because we do not have good career prospect for students who take Chinese history? Now, the anti-extradition route shows that our young people do not have a proper understanding of the country, and that can easily give rise to resistance and misunderstanding. Well, we must learn from history. We must make good use of history as a textbook to enhance children's sense of national identity and a sense of being masters in the future. Learning about the country's history should not be confined to textbooks. There should be a diversity of learning activities so that students can learn about the country's history and culture, and they can be more interested. And we must provide more resources and training for our educators so that students can have more opportunities to learn about history and culture. And we can also look at the design of the CS curriculum. There should be more exchange opportunities for students to the mainland to enhance their understanding and appreciation of Chinese history. Thank you. Mr. Kingsley Wong. Thank you, Madam Deputy. Hong Kong has its roots in the country, and the two are inseparable. And students should learn more about the history of Hong Kong and the country. That will enhance their sense of national identity. Then they can develop the ability to tell right from wrong and to be more analytical and critical. History is not just about rote learning. They can learn it in a lively manner, such as visiting important historical places, etc. But then there are still inadequacies in our current way of teaching. Before and after the 1911 revolution, Dr. Sun Yat-sen visited by sea to different places, and I think the contribution of seamen or sailors to the revolution started there. And in 1920, there was a major strike by sailors. It was a way to counter colonialism and a show of major patriotism. I think it is an important historical event we should all take pride in. And this is a very important event. It's been little taught to students, and even the original address of the Sailors Club was little known, and then the government has been procrastinating in setting up a sign to give notice of the address. And in 1953, there was a major fire in Shakip Mei, and who really addressed the needs of the people is not really the Hong Kong government. Rather, there was a rise from 700,000 catties of rice sent by the Relief Association, and FTU helped to distribute it. Who was it really recorded in history? I once visited May Hall House. It talked about the Shakip Mei fire and how the colonial government started to build public housing to rehouse the victims, but there was no mention of the relief given by the country. Now, I think they have deliberately not mentioned this important rescue action, and I think this is a wrong perspective of history. Well, we must not continue to use the Western perspective in teaching history. The Queen Victoria statue is now still at Victoria Park. The Cultural and Services Department refused to set up a statue at Shangwan to commemorate the great strike by sailors. Now we must have a proper perspective of history. We must look at history from Chinese Hong Kong's perspective and not the British history perspective. Since this debate will not be able to end today, so the President has directed that we adjourn at around 6 p.m. Dr. Priscilla Leung, Madam Deputy, President Xi said in his important address that Hong Kong could only prosper when its young people prosper. So to build a future for Hong Kong, we must guide our young people to be keenly aware of the trends in both our country and the world and enhance their national pride and sense of being the masters. Now, Professor Lau Chi-pang's original motion should get the support of everyone here. The question is how and what. I think the most controversial part is not about making Chinese history a compulsory subject, rather the grading system. I think I was the first to raise a concern about liberal studies. In this council, it's been 14 years. Now, 250 hours were allocated to a core subject, accounting for an important portion of the core subjects for DSE. As a result, many students could not or did not have room to have a few more elective subjects. So in making a certain subject compulsory, I'm always rather cautious. As regards Reverend Peter KOON's suggestion, I think it's rather vague. Now, if you talked about making including Chinese history as essential learning experiences, this is rather vague. I wanted to support Mr. Lee Chan-keung's amendment, and that is to study the possibility of making Chinese history a compulsory subject. And then his amendment included the development history and process of the Communist Party of China. But then Mr. Lee has withdrawn his amendment since. Now I've thought about this subject. I have consulted Mr. Ho Han Koon, a teacher in Chinese history, a very senior one, and his view was there were already a number of core subjects in DSE, and our students would resent an additional core subject. Although I want a basic law to be a core subject too, I understand that it will not be acceptable students. So Mr. Ho asked whether there can be some adjustment by means of CS. That is, students can be allowed to choose between CS and Chinese history. The government decided to use CS to replace LS, and that has allayed our concerns. I followed up on education issues for a number of years. Under our current arrangement, if we add or if we enrich CS to make up for the shortfall, I think it would be welcomed by Professor Lau. And if we want to enhance our young people's understanding of Chinese history, I think we must include contemporary history and also the roots of the country. Now, if we have to include the relationship between the development of the country and Western countries, I think from young people's perspective, that would be a little bit too much. I think we may have to wait until people are in universities, or for young people who really love history and if they want to dwell deeper into the subject, that would be an appropriate approach. So I am at a dilemma when it comes to the original motion and the amendment. I think I can only support Reverend KOON's amendment, but I have to point out that the presentation of the amendment is not entirely satisfactory because we used to evade the question in the past. Now, I'm of the view that we should use technology to promote the learning of Chinese history. Now, the story of the three countries, well, it's one thing. If we have some high-tech applications, if we can have a time tunnel for us to go back to ancient history, I'm sure that will be very popular among students.
Mr. Tong Li-jie, Madam Deputy, I was a science student. Still, I was very interested in Chinese history. As a Chinese people, as a Chinese person, we should learn more about the history of our country. And also, Chinese history is essentially a lot of interesting stories. For example, the Three Kingdoms, the Qin dynasty, and also the Eight Powers expedition, as well as the anti-Japanese war, the War of Resistance. It is a story about love and camaraderie, and it is very beneficial for nurturing our moral standard. Concerning Professor Lau's motion to step up Chinese history education for secondary school students so that they have better senses of belonging to our country, affection for the people, and sense of national identity, I support these overarching principles. However, I have reservation, or great reservation, concerning making it a compulsory subject. Now, it is already a compulsory subject at junior secondary level. And also, at primary school level, there are a lot of Chinese history elements in the general studies subject. Now, if we make senior secondary school students who are more mature to learn Chinese history, to take examination, is that the best way to go, or would that be counterproductive? Now, one of the purposes to reform the senior secondary curriculum is to reduce the number of subjects and also the number of examinations to alleviate stress for students. Now, with 6 or 7 subjects, students can have in-depth study in their subjects. If we add Chinese history, there will be 5 core subjects, and it would be like the HKCEE in the past. People will have to take 8 or even 9 subjects. That would be against the purpose of the reform. There are other ways to improve sense of belonging to our country. For example, last year we implemented the citizenship and social development subjects. In the past, under liberal studies, teachers were allowed to choose their own teaching materials, and they focused on criticism. Some parents say that the CS subject is too boring, and the teaching material is always constitution, national security law, and the basic law. It is all about memorizing, and the way teachers teach them, it's so boring that students lose interest. If we can combine citizenship and social development with Chinese history, as well as stressing the importance of the unification of the country and also national security, it will be much more effective. The premise is that we have to have trustworthy teachers and also trustworthy teaching materials. Otherwise, whether it is the CS subject or the Chinese history subject, the purpose would be distorted. This is something that we lack in the past. Once we make Chinese history a compulsory subject, it would only exacerbate the lack of teaching manpower and also the lack of quality teaching materials. Now, fewer and fewer senior secondary students elect to study Chinese history. The reason is multifold. For example, the atmosphere in Hong Kong is less favorable towards Chinese history, and also with the smearing campaign conducted by Western powers and also the anti-extradition bill incidents, it made students lose interest in this subject. Well, I'm not an education expert. I hope the experts can turn around the trend. Well, I don't think that making Chinese history a compulsory subject, simply because there is no other options, would not be effective. It would be putting stress on parents and students. So I support Reverend KOON's amendments. Thank you. Mr. Chu Guoquan. Thank you, President. I thank Professor Lau for moving the original motion and Reverend KOON for amending the motion. Knowing the history of the country and latest national development is very important for all students. 2 years ago, the citizenship and social development subjects has replaced the compulsory liberal studies subjects. It covers Hong Kong under one country, two systems, our country since reform and opening up, and also the essence of Chinese culture. Students have been studying the subjects for 2 years, and also mainland visit tours are being organized as we speak, and also teachers are gaining experience in teaching the C&S subject. The first DSE examination for the subjects will begin next year. Now, this is a critical moment. At this juncture, if we are trying to make Chinese history a compulsory subject, that is the 5th core subject, it would be very perplexing for educators. Many teachers agree with the intent of the original motion. However, they think that if we are adding another core subject for senior secondary students, it is not the right time and we lack the conditions. The reasons are as follows. There are 4 core subjects for senior secondary students, that is Chinese, English, mathematics, and the CNS. With another core subject, the lesson time for core subjects will account for more than half of the total lesson hours. And then all the previous reforms would be in vain. Second, if Chinese history is made a compulsory subject, it will take up a certain amount of lesson hours. It will also hinder students' learning in STEAM and also applied learning subjects. It would be against the principle of diversified education. Thirdly, Chinese history has been made a compulsory subject for junior secondary students. It has extended to Form 3 students this year, and in junior level, students are already equipped with the basic knowledge of Chinese history. If we are making the subjects compulsory for senior students, there will be overlapping with the CNS subject. Fourthly, if Chinese history is not an elective subject for senior secondary students, those students who are really interested in the subjects cannot choose to delve into the subject further, and the university would be very difficult in terms of student selection. Some people have compared Chinese culture and Chinese subjects. Well, if you look at the DSE, only 2.2% of students elect to study Chinese culture. So if we make Chinese history a compulsory and also an elective subject, I wonder how many students would choose to study Chinese history anymore. Now, it is important to understand the change in our country's development as well as the interplay between the Chinese people and the culture. But I think this is already sufficient to have Chinese history education, compulsory Chinese history subjects for the junior high level. It would be better if we include the elements of history, geography, and culture in the senior secondary elective Chinese history subjects. And also we can expand experience learning, for example, VR, study visits, and also visits to museums, and also allow our students to understand the developments of the country through a diversified and fun manner. This will enhance the sense of national identity and belonging, and it will be more effective in terms of encouraging them to learn. So I don't support the original motion. For Reverend KOON's amendments, he no longer mentioned making Chinese history a compulsory subject. However, essential learning experience involves an overhaul of the subject design. I think we should be more flexible in this, and we should only implement this when we have a consensus in the education sector. Thank you. Professor William Wong. President, I don't think that senior students should be deprived of the chance to learn Chinese history. Or if they don't select Chinese history as an elective subject, they will not have much chance to learn more about Chinese history in the future. They shouldn't be cut off from our country's history. In year 2000, Chinese history was made a compulsory subject for junior secondary students, but it is not an independent subject. Some schools combine the subject of Chinese history with world history or the subject of humanitarianism and other subjects. There were very few hours dedicated to Chinese history, and it was only scraping the surface. Now, in year 2018, it was made an independent subject, but there were only some 50 lessons per academic year. Our history is very long. If we only learn about the rise and fall of dynasties, there will be no time to learn about our country's latest development. And there is not time to teach the developments in terms of religions, economies, and other areas in our country's history. For those students who choose not to study Chinese history further in tertiary education, their Chinese history education will stop at junior level. If that's the case, how can we ensure that the young people understand the country well? Now, we can teach Chinese history in a different way at a senior high level, but it must be made compulsory. We have to focus on teaching young people how to think, how to make critical judgment, and also we have to design our course in a creative manner to nurture their interest. Well, for those who like gourmet, you can teach them what gourmet dishes there were in ancient China. For those who like to play games or video games, you can tell them about the development of ancient weapons in the past. Then it would become an interesting topic. And also history is very important in terms of nurturing a sense of national identity. Say, for example, a lot of inventions that modern Western powers are using right now were actually invented by China. And also, during the Marco Polo era, when during the era when and Chinese emissary reached out, we had a very good navigation skill. In the Ming and Qing dynasty, we adopted a closed-door policy, so it hindered the promulgation and also the development of the country's technology. That's why we have been lagging behind. In the past, in terms of architectural skills, military inventions, and scientific developments, our country had a glorious past. If our young people know more about the country's past, naturally, they will become proud of their country. President, I so submit, I support giving senior secondary students a chance to learn Chinese history. It shouldn't be a gap period where they can't learn Chinese history. Thank you.
Mr. Robert Lee. First of all, I thank Professor Lau for moving the original motion, and I thank Reverend Canon KOON for moving the amendment. A lot of citizens criticize that schools have combined Chinese history with other subjects in junior secondary level. As a result, Chinese history cannot cover contemporary history. Youngsters don't know about contemporary history. There is no sense of nationhood. As a result, there is a need to enhance their understanding of Chinese history so that they will understand that Hong Kong cannot be separated from the country. This will also cultivate a sense of identity with the country. This will also help to pass on knowledge of history and customs of China. Making Chinese history a compulsory subject is something that we need to further consider. If we only assess the subject with attained or unattained, it may not be conducive to getting parents and students to give it the importance it is due. In the long run, it will limit the selection of subjects for students. As a result, there is a far-reaching implication. So I think that Well, Chinese history should be made an essential learning experience throughout secondary school education, and there should be school-based approach to enhance the sense of nationhood of students. There can be enhancement of the Chinese language subject. Chinese language can be separated into language and history and culture. Under this part, history of the nation can be added. Teachers can guide students to learn and to discuss topical issues with them. This will enhance their understanding of our history, which in turn cultivate a sense of identity and belonging. This will help them develop a sense of respect to our country. Apart from learning through the curriculum, students can learn through experience. This will be conducive to forging a sense of identity. So under the subject Chinese, there can be mainland visits. Students can participate in these visits and complete topical studies of modern development to get a better understanding of different aspects, say for example, science, economic, societal development of our country. The Education Bureau can increase lesson time for Chinese language and incorporate elements of Chinese history and culture. This will enhance understanding of our nation. This will not change the curriculum framework, and this will not limit student selection of subjects. Meeting adjourned to be continued at 9 tomorrow.